Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I am Matthew Rockmeyer.
And I'm Krista Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, for many across the world, it is Holy Week, the final week of Lent, leading up to Easter Sunday. And boy, oh boy, do we have an Easter story for you today. What if I were to tell you that elements of the Satanic panic were very, very true? Secret cults of murderous devil worshippers, torturing and abusing children in strange rituals, holding human sacrifices. Only it wasn't elite businessmen or heavy metalhead teenagers. No, it was the inner sanctum of the Catholic Church in Toledo, Ohio. And their crimes were being covered up and hidden by a vast network of police, prosecutors, bishops, and priests, and that it would all be revealed by the ritualistic murder of a nun in a chapel on Holy Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday, one of the most sacred days of the year. Buckle up. It's about to get wild as hell as we tell you the story of the Satanic killer priest, Father Gerald Robinson.
Let's begin. Prologue. Sister Mary Curtis. In January of 2002, Catholic nun Sister Mary Curtis, a petite woman with wire-rimmed glasses who taught elementary students at Ladyfield Catholic School in Toledo, Ohio, was reading about the sex scandals that had erupted in Boston.
The Boston Globe had just published an explosive series about Catholic priests who had abused children for decades, and how the Catholic Church had hidden the abuse and simply reassigned the priests to different parishes. And now numerous victims were coming forward, emboldened by the publicity, and she felt it was time to tell her story as well.
She requested a meeting with the Toledo Catholic Diocese. There, she told how she'd been abused by infamous priest Father Chet Warren, who'd been sued by numerous women who claimed he raped them when they were children. But in each case, the statute of limitations had expired. Sister Mary told the diocese how the trauma had affected her life, and how she'd been undergoing expensive counseling and receiving costly prescription drugs to deal with her PTSD.
Diocesan officials then asked Sister Mary to testify before the church's review board, a panel of 6 laypersons that became a requirement for all dioceses after U.S. bishops adopted a sex abuse policy following the outbreak of scandals and controversy.
The panel included an attorney, a medical doctor, a psychologist, a lawyer, and a retired city manager, and was headed by Chairman Frank Link.
On June 11, 2003, Sister Mary Curtis went to the review board, dealing how Father Chet Warren began to molest her when she was still in preschool, beginning with fondling, then forcing her to perform oral sex on him, saying by the time she got to elementary school, he'd become physically violent, pulling her pigtails, slapping her, and sodomizing her.
Then Sister Mary's accusations began to grow bizarre. She claimed Father Chet brought her into a cult of devil-worshipping priests that performed rituals in honor of Satan, Members of her family were also part of this cult, including her father.
She was initiated into the cult at 6 years old, saying, quote,
"The cult members beat a drum, and a priest carried me to a table and vaginally raped me."
They'd bring her to a farmhouse on Rab Road, west of Toledo, a place she called the House of Blood. Her family dog was sacrificed. Her sister forced to butcher it. Cockroaches were placed on her, marking her for Satan. She was locked in a coffin. She witnessed a 3-year-old girl murdered. In her own words, quote,
"At age 11, they made me ingest an eyeball. A bowl containing an eyeball was brought in. It looked like a human eye. One of the leaders said, 'Take it, eat it, chew it, and swallow it.' He said the eyeball would always be with me, and that I would always be a part of them. The group would always be watching me. They wanted me to know they were always watching me. After the eyeball incident, they killed a little girl who was about 3. I don't know who she was or where she was from. All the adults left, leaving me alone in the room. A sea of blood and stench."
The ceremonies were held to, quote, appease the demons and consecrate her to Satan.
When she was in high school, Father Chet Warren was serving as chaplain at St. Vincent Hospital, and he would take her to his quarters where men would pay him to have sadomasochistic sex with her. One of the priests who paid to have violent sex with her was Father Gerald Robinson.
Sister Mary would state she was deeply traumatized, scared of the dark, suffered panic attacks, and that, quote,
"I am particularly devastated spiritually. I have no clue where God was when I was on the sacristy floor or lying naked on the bed, or how he could allow someone who represented him to do those things to me. I find it difficult to attend church. Some days it's excruciating. I walk up to communion and think about oral sex. It's not fair."
Afterwards, the psychologist, Dr. Robert Cooley, who was the only non-Catholic on the board, wanted to go to the police about the allegations, but the chairman was hesitant, saying the allegations were too wild to be credible. The board then started arguing and broke into chaos. Dr. Cooley saying it was mandatory to report all allegations to the authorities.
Other board members said she may believe what she was saying, but she was a victim to her own overactive imagination. That a satanic cult of priests in Toledo was ridiculous. They said she'd obviously read too many Stephen King books and watched The Exorcist too many times.
The matter was put to a vote. When it was asked who believed Sister Mary's allegations were credible and needed to be reported to law enforcement, only one person raised their hand, Dr. Cooley. Again, the only non-Catholic on board.
After the board voted that the allegations weren't credible and authorities wouldn't be informed, Dr. Cooley was told he must respect the board's decision, and he angrily grabbed his papers and stormed out.
But as a licensed psychologist, Dr. Cooley was required by law to report to civil authorities any possible crimes that he learned about.
And the reasoning of the board made no sense to him. If the diocese was so sure the nuns' allegations were not credible, why not let law enforcement handle it?
In September of 2003, Dr. Cooley, along with Claudia Versalati, a victim's advocate and co-founder of the Toledo chapter of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, who herself had been abused by a diocesan leader as a minor, headed to the Attorney General's office in Bowling Green with a copy of the nun's testimony.
They purposely did not go to prosecutors in Toledo, as they felt they could not be trusted. Despite numerous allegations of rape and molestation against priests there, no criminal charges had ever been filed against priests in Lucas County.
They met with Ohio Special Agent Phil Lucas in Bowling Green and gave him the nuns' testimony.
When the Diocese Review Board heard that Dr. Cooley had gone to authorities, they called him and told him his services were no longer needed. He was kicked off the board.
One of the investigators for the prosecutor's office was retired Toledo cop Tom Ross, who reviewed the allegations, and immediately a name sprung out to him: Father Gerald Robinson.
Tom Ross had been working for the Toledo police way back in 1980 when a nun named Sister Margaret Ann Pahl had been murdered in the chapel of the Mercy Hospital in what many thought was a ritualistic manner on Holy Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday. Father Gerald Robinson had been the main suspect in that murder. Not just the main suspect, the only suspect, but in what many claimed was an elaborate cover-up. No charges were ever filed, and the murder was never solved.
Ross informed Detective Steve Forrester of the Toledo Cold Case Unit about the accusations and how Father Gerald Robinson's name came up. And together, they decided to re-examine the 23-year-old murder, an examination which would eventually lead to the only known conviction of a Catholic priest murdering a nun.
Chapter 1. The Holy Saturday Murder.
In 1980, Holy Saturday, the day before Easter, was on April 5th, and it was Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's 72nd birthday.
Sister Margaret Ann Pahl was very old school. She was born in 1908 on a 200-acre farm in Edgerton, Ohio. There was no electricity, kerosene lamps for light, a pot-bellied stove for heat, an outhouse, and a horse-pulled plow was used to cultivate the fields.
On September 24th, 1927, at 19 years old, she became a nun, took a vow of poverty, chastity, obedience, and service, and joined the Sisters of Mercy.
The Sisters of Mercy, no, we're not talking about the band, but an actual Catholic institute, was founded in Dublin, Ireland in 1831 to help the poor and tend to the sick and needy of the world.
Sister Margaret Ann Pahl had long worked at Mercy Hospital, a Gothic 7-story brick and stone building operated by the Sisters of Mercy and built in 1914. The top floor was a convent for 17 Sisters of Mercy nuns, all trained nurses dedicated to helping the sick, wounded, dying, and grieving.
Along with the 17 nuns, 2 priests lived in the hospital as well, working as chaplains. The 2 chaplains were seemingly opposites. There was Father Jerome Swatecki, a 6-foot-tall, 260-pound, gregarious and jolly priest, always laughing and making jokes, and Father Gerald Robinson, a short, thin, quiet, brooding and moody 44-year-old priest, with drooping eyes and a perpetual frown, known to be curt and solemn, distinctly unfriendly.
Sister Margaret Ann Pahl had held numerous positions at the hospital over the many years, as a nurse, a teacher, and a hospital administrator. But as she grew older, her hearing growing worse, she took up work as the sacristan, preparing the chapel for services, laying out the priest's vestments, cleaning, and in charge of the consecrated communion hosts and wine, incense and candles. She was approaching retirement, but kept putting it off because her work as the hospital sacristan was so fulfilling.
She was a stickler for the rules, was known as being a bit dour and strict. Could be a fuddy-duddy, once chastising a hospital employee because of their love for Elvis Presley. But in general, she was well-loved and well-respected, having devoted her long life to helping the sick and poor.
As the sacristan, normally she would have to rise at 5 a.m. to prepare the chapel for services. But since it was Holy Saturday, the only task that day was to strip the altars of religious decorations, a symbol of the somberness of the day and a reflection of Christian mourning over the death of their Savior. So she was allowed to sleep an extra half an hour, a great luxury to the elderly nun.
After her extra half an hour of rest, she rose at 5:30 and put on her Sisters of Mercy uniform, a blue sleeveless jumper over a white blouse with a black veil.
She ate breakfast in the cafeteria and at 6:45 left for the chapel. That was the last time she was ever seen alive.
At 8 a.m., Sister Madeleine Marie entered the chapel and immediately noticed that the statue of St. Joseph was partially draped in white cloth. Since it was Holy Saturday, the altars were supposed to be completely stripped of all symbols of joy or triumph until the Eucharist, or sacramental bread, which is considered the actual body of Christ, is returned to the tabernacle.
Sister Madeleine Mary then noticed a green cafeteria tray in the front pew, filled with pins and candles, tape and cloths, used in preparing the altars, and assumed Sister Margaret was still in the process of removing religious decorations, and wondered what was taking her so long.
At 8:15, Sister Madeleine opened the door to the sacristy, the back room where the communion wafers, wine, chalices, and candles are kept. Something felt off. The shades were drawn, the lights turned off, and she stepped into the shadows to discover the corpse of Sister Margaret lying on the floor.
Her arms were at her side, her legs flat on the ground and pointed straight out from her body, her dress pulled up around her chest, her girdle, underwear and stockings drawn down around her right ankle, exposing her pubic area.
She'd been stabbed repeatedly in the chest, neck, and head, her face swollen and mutilated with stab marks, and what appeared to be an inverted cross drawn on her forehead in blood.
Horrified, Sister Ann went screaming from the room, hollering,
"Sister Margaret Ann has been raped!"
Another nun, Sister Phyllis Ann, ran in and tried to administer first aid, though she could immediately tell she was too late. As she would later say, the horror, it was just the weirdness of it. The first thought was why? There was a ritualist kind of layout of the dead body. It was so neat, so straight. People don't usually die very straight. Two police officers, Dan Dieter and his partner, Dave Davison, were eating their breakfast in the cafeteria, finishing their midnight to 8 a.m. shift, when they were notified a nun had died, and they ran to the chapel and into the sacristy, where they found the body. As Officer Davison later said, "I knew right away it wasn't a heart attack or stroke. There was blood, and you could see stab wounds, and the nun's panties were pulled down around her ankle."
The body was cold to the touch. Then a medical doctor arrived. Soon a dozen more doctors and nurses crowded in. Someone pushed a cart inside with needles, smelling salts, gauze, and emergency supplies. Someone pulled her dress back down to cover her nakedness.
Father Swatecki ran in, out of breath, pushed his way through to the body, kneeled down, and taking out a vial of anointing oil, dabbed it on his finger, and used it to make the sign of the cross on her forehead over the bloody inverted cross the killer had put there, saying, "Through this holy anointing, may the Lord in his love and mercy help you with the race of the Holy Spirit. May the Lord free you from sin and save you, raise you up."
The crime scene was now completely ruined. The markings the killer made in blood on her forehead disturbed, possibly even a fingerprint there, gone. Footprints erased or blurred, the entire room contaminated.
And in the chaos, there was one person who was notably absent, the other chaplain, Father Gerald Robinson. Where the hell was he?
Sister Phyllis Ann called him on the phone, and he said he'd just stepped out of the shower, but he would dress and be down quickly. He never did arrive.
When Father Swatecki eventually found him, he angrily confronted him, saying,
"You did this, didn't you? Why did you do it?"
Father Robinson just stared blankly back at him.
A command post was set up in the hospital's boardroom, and immediately the two officers who were the first on the scene, Davidson and Dieter, were ordered to go investigate a suspicious black man at the Greyhound station.
The officers were incredulous. As Davidson would say years later, "My partner and I basically found the nun, and then they pulled us off within half an hour to go down to the Greyhound station to look for a black man? We were the first ones on the scene. You'd think the detectives would have wanted us to stay. They could have sent any crew to the bus station."
And when the officers arrived at the bus station, no one knew anything about a suspicious person, and no one knew who could have called the police to report it.
Officer Davidson would later say it was the beginning of an organized conspiracy to spare the Catholic Church a scandal. As he'd say, quote, "The Catholic Church had the city of Toledo wrapped around its little finger."
Nearly all the top-ranking police were Catholic, as was the prosecutor, and most of the judges.
Chapter 2, The Investigation.
Photographs were taken, but in black and white, which failed to capture much of the scene. The blood only looking like gray marks, even harder to discern as the floor was checkered. Normally, a scene like this would be videotaped at that time, but that wasn't done.
There were small red dots on Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's face from asphyxiation and broken blood vessels in her eyes, as well as 2 broken bones in her throat, indicating she'd been strangled. And a lack of blood showed she was dead or dying before she was stabbed. Her heart stopped or slowing, which stopped severe bleeding out, leaving only a small puddle of blood.
There were 31 stab wounds in all. 6 stab wounds to the left side of the face, 15 stab wounds to the left side of the neck, 9 to the chest. Her carotid artery, larynx, trachea, esophagus, and left lung all penetrated. 1 stab wound going through the sternum and into her heart, puncturing the left ventricle.
The coroner determined the blade of the weapon was 3 inches long, half an inch wide, and had a distinct shape. 4 sides, not 3 like a normal knife, shaped like a kite when looked at head on.
Although her garter and underwear had been pulled down and her pubic area left exposed, there was no semen found. But the inside of her vagina had abrasions, meaning she had been sexually assaulted, most likely with some hard object, which would eventually be theorized to be a crucifix.
There were no visible signs of a struggle, leading investigators to believe she was attacked from behind, the perpetrator looping a length of cloth around her neck and strangling her before lying her down and stabbing her, then sexually assaulting her. Nothing of any value was taken, despite there being jewel-encrusted and gold-plated chalices in the room, ruling out a robbery.
8 latent handprints were found, though none of them good enough to make a positive identification with. A single hair was found on the door.
Immediately after the body was removed, the hospital sent a worker to go with a mop and bucket and thoroughly clean the room. The crime scene, which had already been contaminated, now scrubbed completely clean. The worker would later say,
"There was blood pooled on the floor and some blood in the sink. I was told to just do my job and keep my mouth shut."
A bloody length of cloth was found sitting on a pew, which later turned out to be an altar cloth that had been laid atop her body in a ritualistic manner before she was stabbed. The bloody altar cloth, with distinct stab marks through it, was put into a brown paper bag, checked into the evidence room, where it would sit untouched for over 20 years. When it was eventually studied, it would shed a lot of clues.
Dozens of people were interviewed.
Sister Phyllis Ann told a detective that she was certain Sister Margaret had been killed in a ritual. The way the body was posed, the legs and arms so straight, and it was one of the only days of the year that the Eucharist, the sacramental bread or wafers, were kept inside the sacristy. She felt that meant something. To Catholics, the Eucharist is the literal body of Christ. So Jesus was physically present in the room during the murder.
One of the doctors who'd rushed to the scene told a police officer that as he came down the stairs, he passed a priest walking in the opposite direction, who gave him a cold-eyed and menacing stare. He didn't know who the priest was, but he said he was about 35 to 45 years old, 5'6", with brown hair.
But the officer didn't bother to write that down, as the doctor would later say.
The policeman seemed more concerned with the next question about whether the window shade was up or down. That always bothered me.
A janitor and a receptionist working in the ground floor lobby stated they heard frantic footsteps about 7:30 in the morning, running along a hallway where the only resident was one Father Gerald Robinson.
A lab technician saw a priest walking out of the chapel carrying a duffel bag.
There were only 2 priests in the building. Portly 6-foot Father Swiatecki, who was in the cafeteria all morning, making jokes and talking up a storm, as was his nature, and Father Gerald Robinson, who claimed he had never left his room and was in the shower and was drying off when he received a phone call from Sister Ann saying that Sister Margaret had been murdered in the sacristy.
The deputy chief who was in charge demanded that all police reports be brought to him personally and that all the copies not be separated. Normally, the forms, which were written in triplicate, were separated and distributed. A pink copy for the reporting officer, a yellow copy for the department, and a white copy for the deputy chief. But the deputy chief wanted them all so that no records were kept. That's weird. Against protocol, highly unusual, unprecedented. Those reports would later mysteriously go missing.
The funeral service was held on April 8th, 1980, in a tiny chapel in the grounds of Our Lady of the Pines, presided over by none other than Father Gerald Robinson.
Outside, storm clouds gathered, thunder rolling, and as the priest spoke,
"Into your hands, Father of mercies, we commend our sister in the shower in certain hope that together, with all who have died in Christ, she will rise with him on the last day."
Then a blast of wind threw open the chapel doors, dead leaves blowing in, rain erupting, lightning striking, knocking out the power in 20,000 homes.
Sister Ann's nephew said the winds were so strong he feared the windows would break and the roof be ripped off.
After the ceremony, Sister Margaret Ann Pahl was buried in St. Bernardine Cemetery, where she lay until she was exhumed 24 years later. Her body perfectly mummified and revealing many missed clues.
11 days after the murder, there was only one suspect: Father Gerald Robinson.
Chapter 3. Father Robinson.
Gerald John Robinson was born in Toledo, Ohio, on April 14, 1938, in the Polish neighborhood La Granica. His parents descended from a wave of Polish immigrants that flooded into Toledo in the late 1800s. He was raised with two very distinct cultures that would dominate his life forever: Polish and Catholic.
Gerald grew up speaking both Polish and English and going to Nativity Elementary Catholic School. His mother served in the Altar Society of St. Hyacinth Church, and from a young age, his mother, Mary, said he was going to become a priest. It was a dream of many Polish women at that time to have a son become a priest.
He was sent to St. Mary's High School, a seminary outside of Detroit, Michigan, about 6 miles north of Toledo. From there, he attended St. Cyril and Methodius Seminary in Orchards Lake.
The Orchard Lake schools were founded by Polish priests in the 1800s to provide a seminary education with an emphasis on Polish culture and heritage.
Gerald was known as a quiet and studious boy who took his faith and studies very seriously.
After graduating from seminary, he was ordained a priest in the Toledo Catholic Diocese on May 30th, 1964.
Being one of the few American-born priests in Toledo who spoke fluent Polish, he was assigned to St. Albert's Church in La Granica. The sermons were given in Polish, the confessions heard in Polish as well.
In 1972, John Paul II was appointed pope, which was greatly celebrated by the Polish community. There was a Polish pope.
Is the Pope Polish? Do you remember when everyone used to say that?
Yeah.
Everyone who knew Father Robinson, even those who liked him, said he was an odd duck, a bit off. One fellow priest saying, quote, "He could be very friendly on occasion, and on others, he would just ignore you."
Another priest said,
Father Gerald was very moody. There were those days when he would smile and say something, and other days, nothing. He was just a little unpredictable that way.
The organist of the church stated, he was a quiet loner. He'd walk in and not say a word. He'd walk right past you, like you were a wall.
After his father died, Father Gerald Robinson moved in with his mother, his next-door neighbor saying he never spoke a word to her or her family in more than 10 years. Not even a hello.
Interestingly, when he'd wash his car, he'd blare Black Sabbath.
Ozzy, rest in peace. It's an interesting choice of music for a priest, especially at that time. But I don't know, maybe he just liked Tony Iommi solos. Can't blame him there.
But he had his fans as well. One member of his parish, Marianne Plua, said, quote, "He's a good man. He's a real quiet priest. At parties, he would just stand in a corner. He always dressed as a priest. He would never wear t-shirts or something. He's just wonderful. You would never find a priest like him. I don't care what anybody says."
On April 16th, 1980, investigators asked Father Robinson to come to the station and be interviewed about the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl.
At the station, the priest gave conflicting remarks, was vague about where he was, then stated,
"Someone came up to me on Wednesday and confessed he was responsible for Sister Margaret's murder."
"Who was it?" the detective asked.
"I can't say."
"Was it male or female?"
"I can't say."
"Father, do you realize how serious this is? You're telling us that someone confessed to murdering Sister Margaret Ann Pahl? And you won't give us any details? You know this is a murder investigation."
"Well, I just made that up."
The detectives were stunned. "You did what?"
It's not true. I made that up about hearing the confession."
"Why would you make up such a story?"
I was trying to protect myself. I'm tired. I want to go home. I was just trying to give you something so you could get this over with."
"Father, that was definitely not the way to get this over with."
It's fucking crazy. He's a lying piece of shit, dude.
Ugh.
They then gained permission to search his room. As they walked up to the room, Father Swatecki stormed up, screaming at Father Robinson, saying, quote, "For God's sake, tell them what you know."
"What was all that about?" detectives asked.
"I have no idea," the priest replied.
The detectives searched the small apartment, a depressing-looking place. The room was small, just 10 foot by 12 foot, painted pale green, the only decoration a crucifix on the wall.
They were looking for the murder weapon, a small knife with 4-sided kite-shaped blade, 3 inches in length.
They found a bottle of Valium, and by his desk, a silver sword-shaped letter opener, 9 inches long, with a ribbed metal handle, knuckle guard, and 2 pentagrams on it, one facing upwards, one downwards, as well as a medallion with the Capitol building on it, with a 3-inch kite-shaped 4-sided blade.
"Well, what do we have here?" detectives asked as they put it in an evidence bag.
Father Robinson stated that he'd received the letter opener as a gift when he was a Boy Scout chaplain in 1969, that a scout troop had given it to him after a trip to Washington, D.C.
They brought the letter opener back to the crime lab, and when hearing there was a possible weapon in the nun murder, a technician said, "I'll be down there quicker than a bull can crap in a candy store." A phrase I fucking love. I don't even know what it really means, though.
Had you heard that before this?
No, I've never heard that before.
Yeah, that's wild. I don't think it makes much sense either. I'm trying to think, would like lots of candy be like a laxative to a bull? It's kind of wild. Maybe we should say that should be the new murder poster like mantra. Or no, not mantra. What am I trying to say? The new murder coaster pet phrase.
Quicker than a bull can crap in a candy store.
The technician looked the letter opener over with a microscope. It was spotlessly clean, not a smudge, not a fingerprint. It appeared to have been recently polished. He tested it with phenolphthalein, looking for the presence of blood. Nothing. But then, thinking blood could have seeped into the cracks, they removed the medallion with the image of the Capitol, tested the area beneath it, and, for a moment, it glowed.
Just a speck, much too small to conduct any further tests. Still, The letter opener showed an indication of blood.
The next day, they brought the priest back to the station, this time to perform a polygraph. He was eerily silent, one eye drooping, somber, strange.
When asked if he knew any reason why someone would kill Sister Margaret Ann, he said, well, she had a dominant personality.
What?
She was a dominant woman. After this misogynist statement, he began contradicting himself, at one point saying he was drying off with a towel when he received the phone call about the murder, then saying he was actually buttoning up his cassock.
He showed deception on the questions concerning her murder, failing the lie detector test.
Now the detectives began to really hone in, bringing up the weird letter opener, and just as they were ramping up the interrogation, Deputy Chief Vetter arrived with one Monsignor Jerome Schmidt, one of the most powerful clerics in the Catholic diocese, a cigar clenched in his mouth, flanked by attorney Henry Herschel.
Wordlessly, they took the priest and left the interrogation room, leaving the detectives stunned. As one later would say, when a suspect walks out of an interrogation with an attorney and the deputy police chief, not to mention a Monsignor, you can assume it's pretty much over. He's not talking anymore tonight, or maybe ever.
And after that, the case went cold and would remain unsolved for the next 23 years.
Chapter 4: Toledo and the Catholic Church.
Toledo was a Catholic town, and the church wielded great power. This was no secret.
On Sundays, police were ordered to direct traffic outside Catholic churches and to not write parking tickets or even give speeding tickets for cars outside the church.
After collection, church ushers were personally escorted to the bank by police to deposit the donations.
And the special treatment of priests was well known and documented. They were untouchable.
The Toledo Diocese has a documented history of covering up the sex crimes of priests, dating all the way back to the 1950s, with one Father Leo Welsh, who had a 2-acre resort on a lake with a dirt track for go-kart racing and a boat for fishing and water skiing. One of the children taken there would call it a, quote, never land for kids.
It was like a paradise during the day, but at night Father Leo would get drunk, turn mean, make the boys wrestle with him, force them to perform oral sex on him, then sodomize them. It went on for years, dozens of boys abused. The ones who told their parents were accused of lying. Their parents saying a priest could never do such a thing, and they should be ashamed to say that. Until finally, one mother marched through the church and into the rectory, angrily telling the parish pastor about what her son claimed the priest had done. The next day, he was gone. His picture removed from the parish wall, no explanation given, no investigation, no police involvement.
In 2002, the priest would say, I was drinking heavily. I was lonely. I went too far. I'm not denying it.
In 1960, when a Toledo priest named Father Alexander Pinter was repeatedly reported to the police for raping altar boys, and the police were put under incredible pressure to arrest him. Instead, they met with church supervisors and arranged to have him sent to Canada. He was eventually made a parish priest in Louisiana and died in 1974 at 59.
In 1985, a priest named Father Denny Gray, who was teaching religion at Central Catholic High School, a cigarette-smoking, hard-drinking priest with a penchant for dirty jokes, who surrounded himself with troubled teenage boys seeking a father figure, grabbed an altar boy by the neck and told him he must submit to punishment. Soon rumors began surfacing that the priest was getting teenage boys drunk and raping them, telling them they were queers and that they liked it and that they deserved it.
When church officials heard the allegations, they simply removed him as a teacher and put him in a position where he'd have no access to children. No police report, no investigation.
In the early 2000s, Father Denny would be sued more times than any other priest in Toledo. All of the lawsuits were settled out of court.
Eventually, the Toledo diocese would pay a total of $1.9 million to plaintiffs who claimed they'd been sexually assaulted in an effort to sweep all allegations under the rug.
In 2004, a documentary would be made about one of the boys abused by Father Denny, a guy named Tony Combs, who'd become a firefighter and father of two. The movie was called Twist of Faith and was nominated for an Academy Award.
Bishop James Hoffman, who led the diocese from 1981 until 2003, stated that in the 1960s and 70s, if a priest was found to be sexually abusing children, it was just seen as a moral failure, and they'd be sent to a retreat or monastery, where they'd make a good confession, then be put right back into ministry.
On December 9th, 1984, police officer Bill Gray was called to the public restroom of a department store and opened the door to see a young boy on his knees performing oral sex on a priest named Father Robert Thomas.
He knew the department police procedure was to not arrest priests, but did so anyway.
And afterwards, he was bombarded with threatening phone calls and letters and told not to come back to church.
The priest was found guilty, but his arrest and charges were sealed. He got no jail time, and the charges were soon expunged. The police report mysteriously disappeared from the files, and today there is no official record of the arrest.
But Officer Gray, knowing that that was bound to happen, had Xeroxed the report and still has it to this day to prove that it all went down.
Police reports involving priests often mysteriously disappeared. The 5-man task force that investigated the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl were all Roman Catholics, and the supplemental report about Father Gerald Robinson disappeared as well.
The original officer on the scene, Dave Davison, who was sent off to investigate a suspicious black man, so fucked up, man. He was incensed over it all and was constantly writing to authorities, asking them to please reopen the investigation, saying there had been a cover-up.
In a desperate attempt to get attention, he even wrote the governor and the president of the United States, their representatives writing back that they had no jurisdiction in the matter.
In 1995, he began requesting police reports about the murder and a copy of the autopsy, and was told the records weren't available because the investigation was going to be reopened. And the prosecutor, one Anthony Pizza, nice name, wonder if he's Italian, Anthony Pizza, called him on the phone and threatened to ruin his life, to sue him, and to take everything he owned.
Officer Davison would later say, quote, "People won't admit that priests are human. They think they're all above it. That's just stupid. The collar doesn't make you holy. It's just a fashion accessory. My dog's got a collar. The only way some people would ever believe Robinson killed Sister Margaret Ann was if they saw it with their own eyes, or they saw it on videotape. And even then, some people probably wouldn't believe it."
Chapter 5, A New Century and a New Investigation.
On December 4th, 2003, nearly 23 years after the murder, Steve Forrester of the Toledo Police and Tom Ross of the Prosecution Investigation Unit reopened the case of the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl.
The first thing they did was check out the physical evidence that had been collected.
In a box labeled item number 4330, they found the altar cloth that had been found lying on a pew. It was 10 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, with lace trim, covered in bloodstains with a cluster of odd-shaped puncture holes. Also in the box was the letter opener.
There was also fingernail clippings, a bottle of Valium prescribed to Gerald Robinson, the nun's clothing, hair samples, and body swabs, and they hoped they would find some DNA.
DNA was recovered under a fingernail and in her underwear that contained a Y chromosome, meaning it came from a male. But beyond that, the samples were too minuscule and degraded to find anymore.
But the altar cloth that had never been examined, just bagged up and put in storage, held some very tantalizing clues.
The holes seemed to match the letter opener, and an acorn-shaped bloodstain was a perfect match with the knob at the end of the letter opener. Another stain appeared to clearly match the shape and curvature of the blade.
And when the altar cloth was examined more closely, there was a clear form and symmetry to the holes, that of an inverted cross. So perfect that it appeared an inverted cross or upside-down cross or crucifix was most likely laid atop Sister Margaret Ann Pahl and used as a template.
So a national expert was called in, Ms. T. Paulette Sutton, one of only 5 bloodstain pattern transfer analysis experts in the world and co-author of the definitive textbook, Principles of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, Theory and Practice.
First, she tried to eliminate the letter opener as the weapon, as it was easier to eliminate a weapon than it is to confirm one.
She wrapped the letter opener in thin plastic, then dipped it in sage blood and used it to make various patterns, which she then compared to the stains on the altar cloth. All matched the bloodstains on the altar cloth, and one circular stain perfectly matched the image of the Capitol building that was embossed on the opener. She came to the conclusion that, quote, the letter opener is consistent with the bloodstains found on the altar cloth. If it wasn't this letter opener, then the stains were made by an instrument of the same shape, same size, and same configuration.
They then consulted with one Father Grob, the exorcist for the Archdiocese of Chicago. Yes, they went to an exorcist. Gotta love it. He stated that the killing appeared occult, as it sought to defile everything that was sacred. An inverted cross mocking the crucifixion, composed of 9 stab wounds mocking the Trinity. He felt the murder was a ritual designed to degrade, defile, and kill a woman who'd consecrated her life to God and was in a virginal state and a bride of Christ, stating the purer the sacrifice, the greater the power it brings. An actual virgin sacrifice, both literally and figuratively.
The exorcist also felt the altar cloth pointed to a ritualistic murder as well, stating that it is meant to cover the altar, and by covering Sister Margaret with it, she was transformed into the altar of sacrifice, followed by anointing her head in blood with an upside-down cross.
All on Holy Saturday, the most holy day of the year, in the sacristy, where the preparations are made for celebrating Mass, on one of the only days of the year when the Eucharist, which Catholics believe is the literal body of Christ, is in the room.
The exorcist told the detectives, I believe the devil exists. Just as there are those who give their lives to God, there are those who have given themselves over to the devil. Priests are not immune from such temptation.
They then contacted Dr. Dawn Perlmutter, director of the Institute for the Research of Organized and Ritual Violence, who stated that it was a classic ritual murder, held in a sacred place, and that the letter opener held magical significance as it had 2 pentagrams, one facing upwards, one facing downwards, representing the duality of nature, dark and light, good and evil, always in flux.
When asked if the letter opener was the murder weapon, why didn't the killer throw it away? She said ritualistic killers will almost never get rid of the ritual knife. It is their most magical tool, of great importance and value, and that keeping it there on his desk in full display was more mockery. She also speculated that Sister Margaret Ann Pahl had been sexually assaulted with the same cross that had been laid on her chest during the stabbings.
Chapter 6: Father Chet Warren and the Demonic Cults of Toledo, Ohio.
Father Chet Warren, the priest who Sister Mary accused of running an abusive satanic cult way back in the beginning of our story, had been barred from ministry in 1993 after numerous allegations of sexual abuse were made against him. But he continued to dress as a priest and wear a clerical collar and sign cards as Father Chet.
One of the children he had abused was Barbara Blaine, who went on to found SNAP, the survivors network of those abused by priests, which now has more than 19,000 members in 60 chapters around the world.
Another survivor, Teresa Bombries, became a school teacher and sued the Toledo Catholic Diocese in April 2002. It was the first clerical sexual abuse lawsuit in Toledo after the nationwide crisis began in Boston.
She stated, quote,
"He used our faith, my faith, to keep me from telling anyone. He told me the acts that we were doing were acts that God wanted me to do and to keep it secret, and I would receive rewards in heaven. If I didn't do what he asked, I'd spend time in hell. He described to me satanic rituals and said that if I got involved with that, I would have to go through an exorcism. You know, it's hard for people to really understand this, but it was real. It happened, and I've lived with it for most of my life."
Another woman stated that she was taken to a farmhouse in the 1960s and abused by priests in ritual sexual ceremonies, where she was placed on an altar and gang raped.
Teresa would theorize that the priests would put the children in such bizarre situations that adults would refuse to believe the wild stories, which, if true, worked perfectly. As soon as ritualistic devil worshipping was mentioned, the survivors lost all credibility.
Teresa says the most important thing to her was to prevent Father Chet Warren from abusing more children. But when she went to the regional Oblates community, the cleric told her that Chet Warren was no longer a priest. But the truth was, he was still a priest. He wasn't in parish, but according to the Vatican, he was listed as a priest.
According to canon law, which the Catholic Church governs itself by, when a priest is ordained, he remains a priest for life, and that applies to priests who are barred from ministry.
Teresa eventually settled for $80,000, with the stipulation that a notice about the abuse would be sent to all parishes where Father Warren had served, so that people who had been there at those churches could be aware.
But Father Chet Warrens continued to be involved with the Toledo Catholic Church, frequenting a secluded chapel at Blessed Sacrament Parish on the same property as a church-run elementary school.
Eventually, a civil complaint was made against him to ensure that he didn't enter the chapel except when attending public religious worship.
But all of this is just the tip of the iceberg.
In the 1990s, there was a group of 30 Toledo Catholic Oblates who liked to get drunk and engage in raunchy talk, and they were called the Joy Boys.
According to a person who knew them, quote, "The Joy Boys drank heavily and partied strong, and they lived off the bounty of their benefactors. Some of them seemed at times to go beyond appropriate boundaries with either gender.
And the Joy Boys weren't the only strange cult-like group of Catholics in Toledo. There were also the Sisters of Assumed Mary, also called SAM, which was started by lay minister Jerry Mazuchowski. The priests in SAM would dress up like nuns and perform skits at churches. Mazuchowski says about the group, quote, "We did nun drag. We gave each other nuns' names. It was nothing but absolute fun, camp, foolishness."
But 3 women have come forward claiming abuse by the group and stating Father Gerald Robinson, who was good friends with Jerry Mazuchowski, was deeply involved.
In one lawsuit, a woman whose name has never been made public and is just listed as Survivor Doe claims she attended St. Adalbert's Church in 1972, where Father Gerald Robinson was associate pastor. And according to the lawsuit, she was, quote, "kidnapped and held against her will in the basement of St. Adalbert's, and that Father Robinson and other clergy colleagues, including Jerry Mazuchowski, engaged in elaborate, ritualistic ceremonies dressed as nuns. Father Robinson was called Mary Jerry, Mazuchowski called Carrie Jerry. The clergymen dressed as nuns circled around plaintiff Survivor Doe and chanted satanical verses. They intoned that Jesus was Satan's son. They cut Survivor Doe with a knife and drew an upside-down cross on her stomach. They forced Survivor Doe to drink blood of a sacrificed animal. The clergymen forced Survivor Doe to masturbate the clergymen in the circle. Furthermore, the clergymen would rape and or sodomize her. They would tell her she was Satan's child and threaten to kill her if she ever told. End quote.
The lawsuit was dismissed by the Ohio Supreme Courts because it was filed too late, dismissed on a technicality.
Father Gerald Robinson denied ever being a member of the Sisters of Assumed Mary.
When detectives interviewed Sister Mary Curtis about her experiences with Father Gerald Robinson, she told them a disturbing tale, saying that Father Chet Warren had sold her to Father Gerald at St. Vincent Hospital, where he was the chaplain and running a prostitution ring.
She claimed that in 1977, when she was 15, she was taken to the hospital and put in a room with Father Chet. When Father Gerald arrived, Chet told him, "She's all yours. Have fun for an hour."
Father Gerald told her to take off all her clothes. He then put on a pair of black leather spiked cuffs, took ropes and tied her to the bed, spreading her legs and arms. Then she says, quote, "He licked me and he bit my thighs, arms, and breasts. It was painful. He was pinching me and slapping me and calling me whore and pussy and saying disgusting things like you were made for this." End quote.
Took a black whip, smacked her on the thighs, saying, "You whore." He then took the handle, saying, "You deserve this, you whore," and sexually assaulted her with it.
She says, quote, "He was brutal. He's a maniac. He wanted to humiliate me."
Afterwards, as Father Robinson strutted around the room, he said to her, "I'll bet you enjoyed that, didn't you?"
Chapter 7. Arrest.
On April 23, 2004, investigators were told the media had received a tip about their investigation into Father Gerald Robinson, and, worried he might find out and destroy evidence, they quickly secured a search warrant for his house, the same little house his parents had once owned.
Detectives knocked on the door, and the 66-year-old priest answered, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans, his brown hair now turned gray, his dome now bald, his eyes drooping even more than they had 23 years earlier. And they told him they wanted to talk to him about the 1980 murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl.
They tried to put him at ease, to be as polite and respectful as possible, as he silently eyed them with his droopy eyes and thin, dark slits, answering their questions hesitantly and vaguely.
Then they show him grisly crime scene photos of the nun's corpse, asking him, "Do you know who did this?"
No.
Then another photo of her chest, the 9 stab wounds in the shape of an inverted cross. Or this? Who could have done this to an elderly nun?
I don't know.
Then they showed him her underwear around her ankles, her exposed pubic area. Who did this? You said you were in your residence at the hospital the whole morning, but we have witnesses who will testify in court that they saw you at the chapel around the time of the murder. What do you have to say about that?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Then the detective stated, "Gerald Robinson, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl at Mercy Hospital in Lucas County, Ohio, on April 5th, 1980.
It was the first known time in history that an American priest was arrested for the murder of a nun.
They then began a search of his home.
The house looked like a relic from the 60s. Old furniture, ancient television and radio, a yellowed and mildewing cardboard cutout of Jesus framed on the wall.
On the top shelf of the priest's closet, they found a large cardboard box, inside of which were hundreds and hundreds of photographs, some black and white from the early 1900s, some more modern looking, some looking as if they'd been printed off a computer. They were all of dead people. Deceased people lying in coffins at open casket funerals, dressed up with family and friends gathered around them. Dead men in suits, white shirts, ties, dead women in their Sunday gowns. The corpses of children, candles burning in the background, bouquets of flowers. Hundreds of them.
Now, it is an old Polish custom to keep death photographs of one's loved ones. It's an old world tradition, and it was quite common to have photographs taken of the deceased prior to burial way back in the day. But to have hundreds and hundreds of them of complete strangers, it's really weird.
He also had tapes of Black Sabbath and AC/DC's Highway to Hell.
Now, I love these bands and those albums, but I don't know, do you think it's weird that an old Polish priest has them? I mean, Sister Margaret Ann Pahl was upset when folks listened to Elvis.
Yeah, it's a little weird. Like, it's a lot weird. Ugh, I don't know. There was also an old book on his shelf, published in the 1970s, entitled The Occult. In the margins were handwriting and scribbles, many passages underlined. One chapter, entitled Black Mass, described satanic rituals that were performed to mock Christianity, and underlined was a paragraph about human sacrifices. It said an innocent who was placed on an altar during a Black Mass must be sexually abused and tortured in order for the worshippers to receive power from the devil.
Ooh, ooh. Father Robinson's bond was set at $200,000, and friends, relatives, and supporters put up their own homes to secure the money. And he was released from jail on May 3rd, 10 days after his arrest.
Supporters held a party for him at a banquet hall. 70 people showed up, all proclaiming his innocence, including his secretary, B. Orlowski.
In the middle of the celebration, a woman showed up with a nun doll, screaming,
"I am here for Sister Margaret. She is the one who suffered. Justice for Sister Margaret."
As she waved the creepy nun doll about, a guy grabbed it out of her hands, and she knocked his glasses off, ripped his shirt, then grabbed a pitcher of water and threw it in his face, shouting,
"To honor Sister Margaret, I will go to jail."
The bishop put Father Robinson on leave of absence and announced the church would not be paying his legal fees. But a former sheriff's deputy turned business consultant helped raise $14,000 for his legal fees, and attorneys John Thebes, who'd had Gerald Robinson as a pastor when he was a kid, as well as Alan Knopp and John Callahan, both highly successful attorneys, and Nicole Corey, only 28, all agreed to work for him pro bono.
Prosecutors then exhumed the body of Sister Margaret Ann to perform another autopsy. She was perfectly mummified, the stab wounds still completely clear, as if she'd been waiting there in the ground to reveal her secrets.
This is one of the spookiest cases we've ever covered, isn't it?
Yeah, it's it's very odd that she was fully mummified. Like, was there anything ever discussed about why that was the case?
It's just the coffin didn't leak. You know, if a lot of times the water will eventually leak into the coffin, like it'll break the seal, and it makes a total mess when they try to exhume the body. But this one is stable. But I mean, and then when they were burying her, the church doors fly open and the leaves fly in, and then the power goes out. It reminds me of that movie, The Omen.
Yeah, for sure. It totally does.
Evil priests. On her jawbone was a mark from the murder weapon, a triangular-shaped impression about 1/4 inch deep. And when the letter opener was placed in it, it fit like, quote, a lock in a key.
The defense was incensed that the prosecution had exhumed the body without their participation. And they hired Dr. Kathleen Reichs, a noted forensic anthropologist and author of the fictional Bones novels, which the TV show is based on. Dr. Reichs stated that by inserting the letter opener into the mark on the actual jawbone instead of using a cast, they'd contaminated the evidence, saying it could have caused a modification of the edges, causing a defect. And the reason it fit so well was because they'd pressed it into bone.
So the prosecutors, in turn, hired Dr. Henry C. Lee, the most famous forensic scientist on Earth, with a doctorate in molecular biochemistry, who testified in the O.J. Simpson trial, authored 200 books, and was famous for explaining blood splatter on the stand at trials by spitting ketchup onto paper. Have you ever seen this guy do that?
No.
Crazy. He's like, this is how the blood splattered.
That's wild. Dr. Lee got down to brass tacks, forgoing all the occult ritual stuff and focusing on the facts of the murder, stating it was obvious the killer knew the victim, as he knew she'd been in the sacristy, knew when she'd been there, and that she'd be there alone. Furthermore, knowing that the sacristy was in a secluded setting. An intruder would never have known all of these things. He said the frenzied attack, the brutal overkill, showed it was personal. A killing of hatred or vengeance.
He then turned his attention to the altar cloth. He sprayed it with a chemical enhancer that further defined the blood patterns and confirmed that they clearly matched the shape and design of the letter opener, but pointed out that there was no way of knowing how many saber-shaped letter openers with the capital emblem on the handle existed, and therefore he could only conclude that an instrument exactly like it was used, saying, quote,
"You can see the pattern pretty well, but the only conclusion I can reach is that it's similar. You really don't know how many of these letter openers were made. Could be hundreds, could be thousands, could be millions, I don't know."
And it's interesting to note that this game of chess between the defense and prosecution, each hiring different experts to counter the other, was going on before the trial even began.
At this point, the pedophilia and sex scandal cover-ups of the Catholic Church were big news, worldwide, and in an effort at better public relations, the Toledo Diocese pledged complete transparency and promised full cooperation with the county prosecutor's office. So investigators went to the diocese headquarters on December 15th, 2003, and requested the files on Father Gerald Robinson.
The chancellor gave them a manila folder, very slim, that contained nothing more than his photograph, a page of biographical information, and an outline of his diocesan assignments. Just 3 pages in total. There was no performance reviews, no internal documents relating to the 1980 murder investigation, which he'd been a main suspect of.
Meanwhile, sources were telling investigators that the church had much more information on the priest, but those files were kept in a secret location.
Okay, it gets really wild here. This is nuts. Investigators looked into the book of laws governing the Roman Catholic Church, called the Code of Canon Law, and found that church law requires that bishops conduct investigations on any priest suspected of wrongdoing, and that these files are to be kept in secret archives, what they call sub secreto, Latin for under secret, that are to be guarded so carefully that church leaders are forbidden from volunteering information about them or consenting to them being searched. The code also states that even if documents are removed from these secret archives and destroyed, the church must keep a summary of the documents. Furthermore, bishops and chancellors are barred by church law from even acknowledging that these secret archives exist.
Armed with this information, investigators then went to a judge and got themselves a search warrant, what legal experts believe to be the first search warrant ever seeking access to a U.S. diocese's secret archives, and went back to the Toledo Catholic Center to search for the files.
But it didn't exactly go as they wanted it to. When they went to the bishop demanding he take them to the secret archives, he just laughed and said, "There are no secret archives," which he's bound to do. He's got to deny their existence by law, by the canon law. And he then called church's lawyers, who rushed over.
Investigators told them any files would be in the document room. But it's a huge building, multiple floors, with libraries, study areas, suites of offices. The files could be anywhere.
Attorneys unlocked the document room for them, and while investigators rummaged around, suddenly an attorney appeared with a thick file of 148 documents on Father Robinson, saying, "Here it is, this is all of it, everything we have, the complete file on him." It was unclear where the lawyer had found this file that investigators had been told earlier did not exist.
But when they started going through the file, any mention of the murder was conspicuously absent. Very suspicious, especially as it was on record that Robinson had been investigated by diocesan detectives both in 1980 and 2003. Where were those papers?
It appeared obvious that the church had hidden information from the file, and they suspected they were being kept in the chancellor's office. So they immediately got another search warrant to search the chancellor's office, stating that the church were being obstructionists.
The very next day, they were back to search the chancellor's office. In that search, they found a large stash of files marked privileged, including cases of sexual abuse on children by priests and reports of abortions that had been paid for by the diocese. Fucking irony of ironies. But there was no information on Father Robinson. They'd hit a dead end. The Catholic Church of Toledo was not going to give up any information on the murder.
Chapter 8. The Trial.
After a flurry of pre-trial hearings, postponements, and delays, which lasted for years, finally on April 17, 2006, the case went to trial. It was completely filmed and televised every day by Court TV.
SNAP, or the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, petitioned the bishop that Gerald Robinson should not be allowed to wear his priest collar. But the bishop stated that while child molesters were barred from wearing the collar, murder suspects were not, and the old priest was allowed to wear his collar. And I actually watched this trial on Court TV while it was going down, and I have to say, that priest looked so fucking evil. He had those drooping eyes and the dour look on his face. I wouldn't have been surprised if he had suddenly sprouted huge bat wings, rose up hissing at everyone, burst through the roof, and just flew away. I was half expecting it to happen. And the priest outfit, in my opinion, just made him look more evil, more sinister.
The specialists that both sides had hired gave their testimony. The witnesses who'd seen a priest that morning in the hospital were called to the stand. Father Grob, the Catholic exorcist, noted the numerous religious symbols and imagery at the murder scene, indicating it was a ritualistic killing.
There was much speculation over whether Father Gerald Robinson would take the stand in his own defense. Normally, defendants are told not to testify in their own trials, but in this case, a priest standing up to claim his innocence might help the case. But in the end, Father Gerald Robinson did not get on the stand, did not place his hand on the Bible and proclaim his innocence, but just sat there at the defense table with his droopy eyes and bald head, looking very much like a servant of the devil.
The weather had been mild and sunny during the trial, but after the closing arguments, it changed, and on Thursday, May 11th, black clouds filled the sky when it was announced that the jury had reached a verdict after just a day of deliberation, finding the defendant guilty of murder.
The judge sentenced him to 15 years to life, meaning he'd be eligible for parole when he turned 81. But that day would not come. Father Gerald Robinson suffered a heart attack in prison on May 2014. He was transferred to the hospice unit of Franklin Medical Center, a prison hospital operated by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitations and Corrections, and died there on July 4th, 2014.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the murdering priest, Father Gerald Robinson. Thank you so much for listening.
And happy Easter. May the bunny, that sacred animal of the German goddess of springtime, Easter, bring you scores of chocolate eggs as we celebrate the fertility and warmth of longer days. And if you want to send us baskets of eggs painted to celebrate the coming of spring, just let us know at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know about anything at all. murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.
Bye-bye.